I found the film really instructive in terms of like the importance of reporting, and that the first reportage of an event really defines it for generations.
Right.
I mean, I think it's sometimes easy to forget that that first narrative can really stick, and that's why
Yeah.
it's so important. And so Paramount was going to do a story on this, which basically means that they're going to run like a 3-minute reel
Israel. Yeah.
before or after or in between a double feature in the theaters, and then they pull it. And you show parts of the reel, or at least explain part of it, and it's not it's it's tilted towards the cops in terms of reality.
Yep.
But they still pull it, and then they try and do it again, or they contemplate doing it again, and they still pull it.
Second one, yeah, they created a second one. They pulled. They when you say pull, it's actually they never put it out. So
Right.
it wasn't
But
like it was distributed and then pulled back. They never
well,
distributed.
did you get a sense of like why, like what, like where, because it's attributed to the head of Paramount, but was it because the head of Paramount did not want this story? They put out, well, why don't you explain
Well,
what they explained? Then I'm
yeah,
curious if you have a notion as to maybe what was influencing that decision.
right. Well, the problem for Paramount was that as you said, the first newsreel had a very sort of pro-police bias in the narration. However, they did have to show some of the footage, and the footage gave lie to, what the police even edited gave lie to what the police were, what the pro-police line was. So I think Paramount put it out originally, was about to put it out and felt, well, this is okay because our narration is pretty much blaming the strikers and so forth. But boy, those images are
Right.
so their explanation to the people who complained was that they feared there'd be riots set off in the theaters, that people would riot in the theaters. Now you could say, well, that's a great excuse, or you could say, well, if they had seen all the footage, a week after it happened, there may have been riots, but nevertheless, it was a suppression of news, no doubt, and definitely favored the police and the company, in holding it back. And then, like you said, they did, when it became known that they had the footage, they did a second newsreel, which was a little more balanced, and they refused to put that out also. So we then come to 2 weeks later when actually the backlash begins, and we actually get the full story begins to come out.
What do you think? And I want to get to those hearings in a moment, and how the story does come out. But do you think? I mean, I know the ostensible reason is quite possible. I mean, I would imagine Paramount's not. Paramount has. I don't know if I believe the safety argument as much as I believe Paramount may have had corporate interests that didn't want
Oh, sure.
this to drive a union, labor fervor, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Do you think that there was also, I mean, and I imagine maybe this is outside of the scope of the research you did, but that there were specific pressures applied on Paramount where people said, like, you can't put this out?
Yeah, well, I wish I had a smoking gun on that, but it's nothing like that has ever turned up. Um, I think it probably was enough that Paramount was still a conservative company, and I mean the fact is, although we could say that there was great labor ferment at the time, and they had many victories, and I think there's a sense in our collective consciousness that, well, back in the good old days, people loved unions, and unions were hailed, and look at all the progress they brought. But in fact, at this time, in the media and by officials, the organizers were largely pictured as radicals or communists or, people who were, anti-American and so forth. So it was, despite the growing strength of unions, it was a very heated time in terms of, how they were pictured. So something that showed them as really victims and martyrs in this would have been a little dangerous and unpleasant for a company like Paramount.
It would have driven sympathy for the union. I mean, and these workers. I mean, it seems absolutely clear. And then also, we should say that this is a fairly nascent industry of news. Like, I mean, there's the level of sophistication. I mean, following this, there are hearings held by La Follette, is that it? From Wisconsin.
Very progressive, yeah.
And Wisconsin at that time was like, I think, center. There was well known for modern labor organizing. Really came out of Wisconsin at that point. And I think in the film, if I remember correctly, this is the first time there was a hearing on the Hill that involved looking at, I mean, visual, like, film, but also, any type of visual presentation.
Right. Officially introduced as evidence. But to get there, I mean, the real turning point was 2 weeks earlier when, like I said, the media coverage stayed pro-police for a couple of weeks. And then La Follette's committee subpoenaed the Paramount footage. And I mean, this may sound kind of familiar, modern day collaborations between Congress and the media, but so that La Follette subpoenaed the footage and then leaked it to a famous investigative reporter of the day, Paul Anderson. Anderson then wrote a 2-part series for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, the first real account of the film, which he described in startling imagery, and he interviewed some of the victims. 2-part series. It was then picked up by the New York Times and some other places. So the public opinion started to turn a bit, and La Follette then scheduled these hearings on Capitol Hill for 3 days at the end of June and early July, and called a dozen of the victims who were there and a dozen of the police officials and rank and file. So it was a sensational hearing. So you went from this total cover-up to now we're getting things brought into the light. And in the hearings then were very bad for the police. And they concluded really with the first screening of the Paramount footage, which was also shown into slow motion, which was also quite unusual at the time. It was reported there were gasps and tears in the hearing room, and just, it's like someone who watches my film today. I think probably they say, well, I understand it's going to be pretty hard, pretty heavy to watch. And then when you watch it, you say, Jesus, that's twice as bad as I thought it was.
Right.
So the same thing happened in 1937. So the hearings then got a lot of publicity and attention, and the official report by the La Follette committee then blasted the police, said the police were, fully to blame, and so forth. So, I guess what I should emphasize here is that because of and I guess only because of the La Follette hearings, Paramount then was forced to release a third version of their newsreel, and they put it out since they had no choice now. They distribute it, and they had the intro was, now it can be shown, as if it couldn't have been shown before.
Right.
And straight from the La Follette hearings, and, you've heard about it, and now here it is unedited. And they then showed a good deal of the footage, but even as I note in the book and in the film, it was edited. They took out the first 15 seconds when the police were really, you mentioned the gunfire and the sounds. They took much of that out. So they were still lying, even when they were finally releasing the footage. And then another kicker is that after all that, the newsreel was banned in Chicago and St. Louis and even in liberal Massachusetts. Some chains refused to show it. So it did come out. A good number of people did see it, but even after all that, it still was, was hidden by the powers that be. And
that first 15 seconds too is incredibly powerful. I mean, folks should check it out. You've got firsthand accounts. Well, it opens up with the story of Studs Terkel, basically
one of my
telling
heroes,
overall stories, and then accounts from individuals who were there. Where did those accounts come from? Are those the audio of the people who were there at that time?
Yeah, they were. It's kind of a long story I shouldn't get into, but they were recorded for a series that I was involved in 1992 called The Great Depression, which aired on PBS. And the audio from those interviews is still available, and I was able to get at it. Never been aired, these particular parts. Like three different people who tell the stories first person. Now the film itself is narrated by Josh Charles, the great actor, but it's sprinkled with these audio accounts by by eyewitnesses. So they're totally first person from that day.
And it tells the story of various people who were protesting, including one woman, Lupe Marshall, who's a mom of three, a social worker who was beaten on that day, and different stories. And people should really check it out. But let me just ask, like the implications once the film got out, even with that first 15 seconds, it really sort of and I think that there's a follow up as to the unionization happens, and even Republic ultimately unionizes, but it does feel like there is a deflation of the energy that had been there, that despite the fact that ultimately it was the footage was partially released, that the efforts to suppress it were effective.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned yourself that the initial coverage is always more important than what catches up to it. We've seen it 100 times, where the truth or the more balanced coverage that emerges never quite catches up to the impression that the first day or week or weeks will leave. So it happened here. It was a real setback, public opinion turning against strikers, and they were also kind of lumped together like violent strikers. And so there was it was a setback for a while. But what happened eventually was that, and the workers did return to work, and ended their strike. But there had been a turning point in terms of it was recognized. Two things were recognized: that the workers basically got, really were the victims in this, and in several other places as well. And so the public opinion did start to turn more towards them, and they eventually, within a year or two, they did win their demands. They did win the recognition of the union, which was the most important thing. And but the other sort of interesting thing is, and it also is kind of amazing why so few people really know about this massacre, is it was the real turning point, as the last major confrontation resulting in anything like this level of casualties. It's never happened again since then. It's very scattered, here and there. And it kind of showed both sides the dangers of, ratcheting it up to this kind of high level. And so, in some ways, the unions, some people have said unions afterwards got a little bit too much in bed with the companies, and managed to negotiate, better contracts. But some people complain they went too far. They were not militant enough. And of course, in some cases, people criticize the companies for caving. But this incredible massacre really kind of calmed things in a way that made people compromise. Like, we can't have this again. Even though the company was and the police were mainly at fault, we can't risk something like this where 10 die and 90 are hurt. So it definitely was a turning point, but all the more amazing that so few people know about it today.
I really got that sense that it was that I mean, because we have examples of the Chicago police
Yeah,
not particularly
I was
not
there in 1968 on
well,
the street.
exactly. We have examples of the Chicago police not exactly reforming over the course of in
Right.
1968, and then revelations about their black sites just
Yeah.
5-10 years ago. I mean, Chicago police,
Have
their
a history.
tactics may have changed, but I mean that's why when what got me thinking after that was, and we just recently did a story about how Reconstruction was. We interviewed about how Reconstruction, the history was lost, and a professor who had taken firsthand accounts from a Senate investigations that went around multiple states in the South, and got firsthand accounts of during Reconstruction how there were basically white pogroms,
Right.
and and of course we know how that worked out. That it worked. It was able to erase that history, and it was able to disempower black people and in this country. And honestly, the feeling I got from that film was that the trauma that was imposed on these workers spread
Mm-hmm.
throughout the labor movement, and it made that there was a sort of like a fear
Yeah.
that was embedded in the psyche of labor at that point.
Yeah. Well,
Uh,
those gunshots carried a real message that was heard. And I get into that much more in the book, on the book, the companion book. But yeah, it's just even in the aftermath, there were protests and so forth, but nothing really was happening until the footage finally came out, which is, I guess, another lesson for today. There's so many relevant things for today, including the controversies we have now with when police footage comes out of
yep.
any assault on any black person or any person. Then you wait for the footage, or you demand the footage. The footage comes out months later sometimes. How many times have we seen footage
Sure.
held up for months, and then it comes out, and it's like, it's far worse than people even imagine. And so that's the same playbook as we saw back in 1937.